We got another one of them, popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts. No argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to talk about Dark Side of the Ring, Buff Bagwell. A very interesting Dark Side of the Ring. One that is very good. It is sex, lies, and violence. An incredible story for Buff Bagwell. It includes Buff Bagwell shooting his own father, him being a supreme mama's boy, and to top it all up, he ended up being a whore, a male prostitute. Yes, sirree, they didn't talk about it too deeply in this episode, but Buff Bagwell was a male prostitute, and we're going to talk about that because there's a couple of articles that popped up about Buff Bagwell being a male escort, what they call a pro. And also, there was talks of him doing porn. Man, Buff Bagwell fell right on off. There's a lot of things I want to talk about here. The first one, though, is the most obvious. Buff Bagwell shot his own father. What an amazing story. He grew up in an abusive household. His father was out of control. They tell a story. His dad's still alive. Tells a story of his parents outside arguing. Buff grabs a gun, goes outside, pulls the gun on his dad and says, "Just leave her alone, Dad. Go away. Get out of here." The dad goes in the house, gets his own gun, turns around, and he's pointing a gun at Judy Bagwell. Judy Bagwell, the mother, because now we know that Buff Bagwell has a wife named Judy. And Buff shot his father. And his father put his hands up, ended up getting shot in the arm. And he fired 5 shots. He only landed 1, which is kind of consistent with somebody who might be pretty scared. But what an amazing, amazing tale of Buff Bagwell shooting his own father. It sounds like kayfabe. And then the amazing thing is they actually made up after that. I know people who have gotten into arguments with their parents and they never reconciled. This guy shot his father, and his father was man enough to say, "I was out of control. I was in the wrong. You were right." And I just sat there, bro. I legit sat there and was like, who are these people? Like, like that's like some real man stuff right there. You get shot by your son and you say, "You know what? My son had to shoot me. I must have been really out of my mind." And then apologized. Took a couple more months, but he apologized. And now they're good friends. And I was like, I can't believe that. He shot his father. And Buff's talking about how he has no regrets. He would do it again. His dad got a plate in his arm now. It was crazy. Just crazy stuff. So let's talk about the wrestling part. So Buff Bagwell, immediately out of high school, becomes a stripper. Now, he got married, and so he needed to take care of, his wife and everything. So he becomes a stripper right out of high school. And around this time, he comes across Missy Hyatt, the old manager in the 80s. And his brother, Buff's brother, was trying to get into wrestling. He tells Missy Hyatt, "Oh, yeah, my brother's trying to get into wrestling." And she says, "Why don't you get into wrestling?" Because at this point in time, Buff is really into weightlifting and being a bodybuilder. And you have to have a bit of a body in order to be a stripper. And, she talked him into wrestling. So he goes and learns how to wrestle from Steve Lawler. And he plans with his wife that she's going to continue to work while he works on his wrestling dream. And then once he gets this huge contract from WCW, he's going to essentially retire her and take care of her for the rest of her life so she won't have to work anymore. That's the plan. That was the plan. It didn't quite happen. So then they started showing footage of the handsome stranger, which I vaguely remembered. But the first thing that popped into my head is Tuxedo Mask from Sailor Moon. And I would have loved for them to spend some time talking about where this came from, because he looks like a stripper. His gimmick was that he was a stripper, because he was a stripper. So he was the handsome stranger in Global Wrestling Federation in like 1991. So he's getting his start. You know, it's a national wrestling promotion, kind of. You know, GWF was kind of one of those middling, not quite an indie, nowhere near WCW or the WWF kind of promotions. And he does that for a little while before he gets the WCW contract. And Missy liked the Handsome Stranger idea, but they didn't use it in WCW, so I don't think so. I don't remember them using that. They breezed through his tag team with Too Cold Scorpio. They breezed through the American Males. They just talked about it a little bit. American Males also looks like strippers because Buff was a stripper. It's just a natural progression, right? You know, Buff he's into himself, and his job has always been to entice women. And Bischoff tells the story about, you know, the American Males was the point of the gimmick was to try to appeal to the female demographic, because at the time WCW's demographic was overwhelmingly male. Also, I didn't know that the American Males actually broke up with Buff joining the NWO. I honestly didn't remember how Buff joined the NWO. That goes to show that I still have a blind spot in my WCW knowledge. So Buff starts doing B movies, which is absolutely hilarious. They didn't mention that I believe Buff Bagwell was in No Holds Barred, the Hulk Hogan movie. I think he had a cameo in that. But he starts doing some really bad, terrible B movies around this time. It was actually kind of horror. It's kind of funny, to be being honest. So he starts a company called Real Buff Incorporated. And basically he hired family members to run errands for him. He's hiring people to open his doors, to go grocery shopping for him, because he's got this huge WCW contract. And so he decides to do what all the greats have ever done, all the football players and all the athletes that you've ever thought of. They hired their family and friends to do favors for them, similar to what you've heard about MC Hammer. You know, he's hiring people to drive him around and run errands for him. And he's just spending this cash because he's making so much of it. In the book Nitro, Buff Bagwell says he was making $150,000 a year in 1991 and 1992. That's $300,000 in 2 years. And Buff wrestled in WCW for 10 years. So if he made $150,000 a year, just assuming he never got a pay raise, if he made $150,000 a year for 10 years, that's $1.5 million. But since we know that Buff got pay raises at some point, I mean, most guys did, all this money, where did this money go? You know, like, that's a football contract. Where does this, at the time, of course, but where did this money go? You know, I can venture a guess. But it's tremendous to even discuss that. It's also not mentioned in Dark Side of the Ring, and it hasn't been mentioned much of anywhere, how highly Vince Russo thought of Buff Bagwell. And a lot of people don't know this, but, you know, Vince Russo had written an article saying that Buff Bagwell could be the next big star for WCW. And he actually did one of those silly work shoot angles with Buff Bagwell and La Parka. It is actually detailed in the book Nitro. I suggest everybody go read it. So Buff Bagwell was probably making quite a bit of money around this time. And the good times seemed like they were never going to end. They even brought his mom in on this thing. So Bischoff is in the Dark Side of the Ring talking about Judy Bagwell, hiring Judy Bagwell, bringing her in. He says he has no regrets in doing so, that maybe it went on too long and went too far. But he thought the creative of using Judy Bagwell was good because, of course, you introduce Mom as a babyface, and she's there to check the ego of Buff Bagwell, who is getting out of control at this point. This is post Broken Neck, by the way. So this is Bischoff bringing in Judy Bagwell, the Judy Bagwell on a forklift thing. Bruh, what a waste of money that was. No wonder WCW went out of business. You paid Buff Bagwell $150,000 in 1990. Yeah, you probably deserved to go out of business at that point. So they also detailed Buff Bagwell's very short stint in the WWF, including his fight with Shane Helms. Now, Buff Bagwell's side of the story, because he didn't talk to Shane Helms, because apparently he still works at WWE and probably not going to converse with Dark Side of the Ring. So apparently they have some back and forth between Buff and Shane Helms. Helms is injured and grumpy. Buff is cocky and, you know, talking too much. Shane Helms calls him a drug addict. Buff claims that he did what's called the Bagwell slap, which was used to show dominance. So he supposedly slapped young Shane Helms in the face. Shane Helms then threw a frozen water bottle and cracked him in the head, made him bleed, embarrassed him in front of everybody. And that was the story, that he wrestled his match against Booker T on Raw with staples in his head. That's his side of the story. So because I'm very interested in this story, and of course I've heard it before, I decided to look at Shane Helms' side of this story. Of course, he's told the story since then, and he talks about pretty much up to the point of getting hit. He agrees that he had burned Buff by disrespecting him in front of the boys, saying something, and Buff punched him in the ear. He then said that Buff outweighed him by like 50 pounds, and so he picked up a water bottle and threw it at him, and then jumped out of the ring. And he said the point was to distract him because he was going to hit Buff back. But the water bottle hit Buff in the head and made him bleed. And he then says that he didn't mention that the water bottle was frozen or anything like that, even though it would kind of have to be in order for it to crack his head open. It would have to be pretty damn solid. I ain't never getting hit in the head with a water bottle and bled. You know, that's just not realistic. But the interesting bit that Shane Helms said, and I want to read this. He says, quote, "When I got to WWE TV the next week, the Acolytes, APA, Ron Simmons, and Bradshaw took my bags and put them on the WWE side. The locker room was really segregated in those days. WWE on one side, WCW on the other. Steve Austin went and pat me on the back." So after he cracked Buff Bagwell's shit open, he actually got welcomed into the WWF locker room. Like, there you go, kid. And there's stories that Buff was not very well liked in the WWF. And it stems from his massive ego that he had gotten from working in WCW. And Missy Hyatt, who has done interviews talking about Buff before, says that basically he was hanging out with Lex Luger, and the two of them were doing a lot of drugs and stuff. And Buff's ego just kind of got out of control. And he became a not very likable person. So the locker room hated him. Therefore, when Shane Helms cracked his head open, the locker room embraced Shane Helms. And that's how he managed to stay in the WWF for so long. Buff Bagwell goes out there, has an absolute pooplet match with Booker T. He's on Dark Side of the Ring saying, "I thought it was good, but even if it was bad, so what? I'm Buff Bagwell. I'm 31 years old. I've got 10 years in the business." It's like, you also weren't very well liked. And there's stories of people stepping on his little Buff hat and crunching it and all this kind of stuff. They didn't like Buff at all. They didn't like Buff at all. Now, another interesting thing, they didn't talk about this in Dark Side of the Ring. They didn't spend any time on it, was his ongoing issues with Jim Ross. I'm not going to read any articles about this. I'm just going to talk about it. So, from the perspective of Buff Bagwell, he feels like he didn't get a fair shake in WWF, that people didn't like him already, and that Jim Ross had lied, that Buff Bagwell was having his mom call and say he couldn't make dates. So Buff claims that after he got his head cracked open, he was still wrestling, and that he was told by the office not to make those dates. And Jim Ross has said that his mom was calling the office saying that he can't make the dates. So that's the issue between Buff Bagwell and Jim Ross. I hate that they didn't go into it, but it would have been fun at the very least to talk about that a little bit more. But that was interesting. So they talk about Buff Bagwell a couple of years after WCW closes. He's on a Showtime TV show called Gigolos. And this is where Buff Bagwell kind of starts spiraling out of control. So this is 10 years after WCW has closed. Showtime is doing a phony pornographic TV show called Gigolos. Now, I did not know this show existed until this episode aired, so excuse my very crude research on the subject. But the way Buff explained it is that he was asked to join the cast of this show, and he wasn't told anything about it. And so he went in there thinking that he was consenting to do a porno, but because there were cameras and people watching, he couldn't perform. And so he basically simulated the sex act with the young lady. He was then told later that he wasn't supposed to actually have sex with this woman, and that what the nature of the show was after the fact. So that became an actual real life discussion. There was a couple of discussions about this Gigolo's TV show. One, people wanted to know how it could possibly be real, even though it was shot in Las Vegas, which has legalized prostitution. Somehow people thought that this show was real. People believed that women had legitimately consented to having sex with men on camera, and everybody thought this was a real TV show. Instead, everybody involved were actresses. That was the point. The men were actors, the women were actresses. None of it was real. But this did open the door for Buff Bagwell to get involved with real escorts. This is incredible. From 2014, Buff Bagwell, it came out and publicly said that he is now a successful gigolo. This was tremendous. So he was on a website called Cowboys for Angels that provided escorts for women. So TMZ says, quote, the company charges a pretty penny for Bagwell services, $800 for 2 hours, $1,550 for 4 hours, and $3,000 for an overnight visit. Weekends are steep, $8,000, and a full week with Bagwell was $25,000. This is incredible. And Buff ended up becoming the second most popular escort on the website. They tell the story that he ended up leaving his wife for one of the women that he met on this gigolo service. And this was amazing. I I didn't keep up with Buff Bagwell, like legit. I really paid no attention to him. So I was surprised that he really did male escorting, which is, I shouldn't have been surprised really, but he did. Later that same year, Buff Bagwell was in talks to do a porn movie for Vivid Video. This was not talked about in Dark Side of the Ring, but it's consistent with him being a stripper and him being an escort, that the next step would be he's a porn star. So this is also from TMZ. Buff, who starred in Gigolos, caught the eye of Vivid honcho Steve Hirsch, who promised a Buff Bagwell film an absolute blockbuster. Hirsch and Buff met recently to hammer out a deal, and there was a third person in the room there, Buff's wife, Judy. Yes, that is correct. Judy Bagwell, the wife, Buff's third wife, knew that he was an escort and was apparently there when he was discussing doing porn. This guy was, I guess if you spend a lifetime getting in shape and staying in shape, this is what you can do with your free time. You know, you need to make money, you can do porn. And it's weird that nobody really, I guess it's where you feel bad for Sonny and you feel bad for China. They got down on their luck. They were drug addicts as well. They started doing porn, and everybody laughs at them because they doing porn and they were doing OnlyFans and all this kind of stuff. Here's Buff Bagwell, full grown man. He was 44 years old at the time. Still physically could probably wrestle and was doing indie shows. Never really, I guess you could say, he did not fully interject himself into a place like TNA or something like that. So he's doing all these side projects that include selling his body for money. But nobody talks about this though. So I guess this is the one time where you actually do kind of feel bad for the girls, because nobody ever forgets that China did porn. Nobody forgets that Sonny did porn. But Buff Bagwell did, well, I don't think he actually made the deal because I couldn't find that the deal was done or that the movie was actually made. Then again, I didn't actually look for Buff Bagwell porn, so y'all gonna have to excuse that I'm not going that far into finding out whether this thing actually occurred or not. So I can't say that it did, but it would have been easy for me to find if it actually had come out. But he was a male prostitute. That part is facts. And he admitted to it in The Dark Side of the Ring. Very bizarre stuff there with Buff Bagwell. So, of course, his life changes when he drugs, alcohol, all these kind of things. He's spiraling out of control for a decade or so and fell into the loving arms of Diamond Dallas Page, who changed his life and kept him around, kept him alive. And that without DDP, Buff Bagwell would indeed be dead today. So it was probably one of the better ones that don't revolve around a very specific incident. Usually the good Dark Side of the Ring episodes are ones that investigate very specific incidents. But the biography versions of Dark Side of the Ring are typically not as good. Dynamite Kid was okay. That was pretty good. And this one was okay. It wasn't on the same level as like Dynamite Kid or the Brian Pillman episode of Dark Side of the Ring that they did. Those were excellent. And I think they were very well researched, and some of them were based on books. Like the Dark Side of the Ring on Dynamite Kid was based on a book. The one on Brian Pillman was based on a book. This one was okay. You know, I think that they skimmed over a lot of things, but they try to cram a lot into that 1 hour, and you just don't get enough done. So Buff Bagwell, very interesting guy. One of those dudes that you've seen him on WCW pretty much every week, but you probably didn't think that much of him. So it was interesting to be able to catch up and get a glimpse into how his life had been. Not just when he getting arrested and all this kind of stuff, but learning about his family, his home life, learning about his struggles, you know, financially, and with painkillers and all this kind of stuff. And he's still around. He's still here. So that's all very cool. What did you guys think about Dark Side of the Ring, Buff Bagwell? Thank you for your time. I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace.